Hello, my name is Jim Payton. I live in Hamilton, Ontario, and I am a retired university history professor. As a historian, I check out footnotes to see what sources are used and how they're used, whether they're used well or not so well, and whether they might be used selectively, taking part of what is said in the source to make a point, but leaving other parts untouched that are also there, but that don't quite fit the narrative. That's what leads me to what I want to speak to you about here, namely, the way in which the Human Sexuality Report appeals to the commentary on the Heidelberg Catechism by Zacharias Ursinus as the committee wraps up its arguments. Quite a while back, I earned a PhD in Reformation-era studies, the 16th century. With that, I have a pretty good sense of what was going on in that time. That was the century when Zacharias Ursinus lived, wrote the Heidelberg Catechism in 1563, and produced his massive commentary on the Heidelberg Catechism, published in 1584, a year after his death. Before I began my doctoral studies, I had read parts of Ursinus' commentary. So when I read the Human Sexuality Report submitted for Synod 2021, and saw it appealing to what Ursinus wrote in his commentary about unchastity, I was intrigued. On page 146, the HSR asserts that the Christian Reformed Church should accept Ursinus' comments there as the way to understand the unchastity condemned in Heidelberg Catechism, questions and answers 108 and 109, which expound the seventh commandment, you shall not commit adultery. The HSR makes sure to point out that Ursinus repudiates homosexual activity. In the online version of Ursinus' commentary on these questions in the Catechism, which the committee used and which I have consulted as well, and that treatment runs from page 1041 to 1050. In that treatment, Ursinus repudiates homosexual activity as, quote, contrary to nature and from the devil, end quote, on page 1043. And, since the Heidelberg Catechism has confessional status in the CRC, then the comments Ursinus made about same-sex sexual activity in the commentary, so the HSR argues, already have confessional status in the CRC. This argument is strange. The CRC has adopted the Heidelberg Catechism, not Ursinus' commentary on the Heidelberg Catechism. It is interesting to read what he wrote several years later about what he had in mind back when he wrote the Catechism, of course. But the CRC is not bound by what may have been in Ursinus' mind. It is bound by what he wrote down in the Catechism. And in the Catechism itself, none of the specific sins Ursinus brings up in his commentary are mentioned. That's an important distinction to keep in mind as the CRC considers the question of confessional status and the committee's recommendation D. But that's not my concern here. What I am concerned with is the way the committee takes some of what Ursinus wrote in his commentary about unchastity, but leaves a lot of what else he said aside, not so much as a mention. That's more than just a little curious. Ursinus has plenty more to say, stuff that would certainly fall within the scope of what the Synod 2016 set up this committee to provide, namely, quote, a foundation-laying biblical theology of human sexuality, end quote. And if the committee's argument is right, that we must hold to what Ursinus wrote in his commentary about unchastity as the way we have to understand and apply questions and answers 108 and 109 of the Catechism, then that stuff should be pointed out in this report too. So, what else, beyond what the committee saw fit to mention, did Ursinus condemn as unchastity in his commentary? Recall that question and answer 108 summons us to, quote, live decent and chaste lives within or outside of the holy state of marriage, end quote. Ursinus warns that unchastity can occur not only outside the holy state of marriage in fornication, but that unchastity can occur within the holy state of marriage in adultery. No surprise here. This is stuff we have often heard and been warned against. But for Ursinus, adultery is not the only way a husband and wife might be unchaste. Ursinus speaks specifically about more than adultery. He also condemns what he calls, quote, unlawful intercourse and inordinate copulation, end quote. That's on page 1042. And what he calls, quote, unlawful copulation, end quote, on page 1050, all within marriage. Ursinus explicitly addresses such unchastity as might occur in the sexual relations of a husband and wife. What was in his mind with that? Well, in the 16th century, unlawful intercourse would have included the use of contraceptives, since all lawful intercourse had to be open to the possibility of conceiving a child from the sex act. In terms we would recognize, that would mean no intrauterine devices, IUDs, or condoms, or birth control pills. But the HSR doesn't mention Ursinus' concern about unlawful intercourse. And in the century when Ursinus lived, what he called unlawful copulation would have included at least certain coital positions commonly used by prostitutes in that time. No godly husband or wife would defile their lovemaking by adopting such positions for sexual congress. But the HSR doesn't mention Ursinus' concern about unlawful copulation. And what did Ursinus mean by repudiating inordinate copulation? I have been advised that the Latin original here, which I have not been able to consult, would be better translated as disordered sex. Ursinus' concern then, however this is translated, relates to the proper order for sex. So, for Ursinus, what was the godly order to be observed if a husband and wife wanted to avoid unchastity in their sexual activity? Could enjoying sexual intercourse too much fall under that condemnation? If so, what would be the proper order in that regard? And how should it be regulated so as to avoid falling into unchastity? And in Ursinus' time, or in ours, how would that be decided? By a pastor? By council? By classis? By synod? Or could Ursinus be warning against a too great frequency of marital lovemaking? If so, what would be the licit number of times a married couple could have sexual intercourse within some specified time frame without transgressing into unchastity? Again, how would that be decided in Ursinus' time or in ours? Pastor, council, classis, synod? Other possible examples of inordinate copulation or disordered sex might have been possible targets for Ursinus' denunciations here. But no matter. As was the case with unlawful intercourse and unlawful copulation, so now, again, the HSR doesn't mention Ursinus' concern about disordered sex or inordinate copulation. Ursinus addresses same-sex sexual activity as unchastity only once. The HSR makes sure to point that out. Ursinus addresses unchastity within marriage 3 times. The HSR doesn't mention any of them at all. So to wrap up, what Ursinus wrote in the commentary informs us today of what he viewed as unchastity, to be sure. But if what he wrote in his commentary is to dictate how the CRC interprets unchastity, as the HSR argues on page 146, a forthright use of his commentary would lead the HSR to advise the CRC how husbands and wives can avoid the various kinds of unchastity which Ursinus declaims against. Those concerns, however, do not even crack the surface of the HSR. Kind of a selective appeal to Ursinus, isn't it?